Hi, I'm John Pasalis, housing analyst and founding broker at Realosophy Realty, where I lead our team of agents in providing data-driven real estate advice to home buyers and home sellers throughout Toronto and the Greater Toronto Area. We launched this Toronto Real Estate Summit because we're getting a lot of questions from consumers about the volatility in our economy and our housing market that was brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're going to be talking to leading economists, housing industry leaders, personal finance experts, and real estate agents to get a better understanding of what's going on in our markets today and what are some of the key things that we should be looking for in the months ahead so you can all make smarter real estate decisions. If you have more specific questions about your home buying and selling needs, please feel free to email me anytime at askjohn@movesmartly.com, and I hope you enjoy this interview.
Hi, and welcome to the Toronto Real Estate Summit. I'm Valerie Garcia, moderating this panel on Airbnb versus long-term rentals. I am super excited to have my guests join me today. These are experts in the field of rentals and Airbnb and landlord tenancy issues in the core and surrounding areas of GTA. So thank you all for joining me. Kayla, why don't you go ahead, introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Kayla Andrade. I'm a landlord advocate for the last 10 years. So I've been an investor myself for the last 17 plus years, and recently just opened up a property management company called Boardwalk Property Management, serving Cambridge, Kitchener, Waterloo, Guelph, and Brantford.
Awesome. Nathan, thanks for joining us.
Hi, I'm Nathan Rotman. I'm the Deputy Director for Airbnb Canada and the Northeast US.
Awesome. Vivien.
Hi, I'm Vivien Wong. I am a real estate sales representative with Realosophy Realty. We are active in the Toronto and surrounding GTA areas, helping people buy, sell, and invest in real estate. We're active in all of those areas. And our thing is really helping our clients make more informed decisions by giving them the information they need to make smarter decisions.
Awesome. And Treat.
Well, it's nice to be here. I'm Treat Hall. I'm broker owner of Treat Hall and Associates, which is a boutique real estate brokerage in Picton, Ontario, in Prince Edward County that takes no listings and represents only buyers. Until November of 2018, I was also a municipal councillor, and that may come into some of our discussions when we talk about short-term accommodation.
All right, so we're going to jump right in with our first question. We know that pretty much everywhere COVID has cooled tourism and demand for short-term rentals, and we've had a lot of questions from investors in the past couple of months who used to rent out their condos or basement apartments on Airbnb, wondering if it's time to convert them to long-term rentals. So let's start by talking about investment condos specifically. And Vivien, I'm going to let you go ahead and kick us off. Is now a good time for investors to switch from long-term, from short-term to long-term rentals?
I mean, I think the short-term rental market is going to be a bit challenging for the next little while, especially I think in Toronto as well, considering we're a bigger city and we are a little bit more COVID-y than some other areas. So, I mean, in terms of switching to short-term rentals to long-term rentals, I think that they are quite different, and I think that's, you know, landlords often gravitate towards one versus the other. So I think that question could also be framed in a personal way, like whether you want to kind of change your business to go towards the long-term side. I do think because the short-term rentals are a little bit more challenging right now, that, you know, perhaps it could be a smarter decision to go to the long-term side if you know, that's something that you know, landlord is open to. Yeah.
Sure. Kayla, what are you hearing out there?
Well, always long-term landlords are going into short-term because of the way that the Residential and Tenancy Act and Landlord and Tenant Board is. Even though the tourism is going to really cool down how often your Airbnb is rented, it's still going to be, it's not an easy flop to go from Airbnb into a long-term rental, because now when you wanted to go back into Airbnb again, it's going to be very difficult to try to take over that unit so that you can go back into Airbnb. So I would try to, look at your finances, see what you actually need to keep it afloat, and see if you can, hold on until it picks up. But I do know that there's still people renting out Airbnbs, even though the slow part of the tourism has gone down. People are still in need of the Airbnbs, and sometimes I think Airbnbs are being used as a temporary housing because of the lack of supply that we do have in Ontario right now.
Awesome. Nathan, thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's actually really, it's an interesting question. We have found that over the course, obviously tourism has taken a significant hit at the height of the pandemic. So, mid-March through May and April. What we're finding as health restrictions start to be, taken back, and people begin to feel a little bit more comfortable traveling, is that people are traveling locally, that families are traveling more than business traveling, than business, the traditional business travel that we see on the platform. And today we have more units on Airbnb than we did in January of 2020. So people are still looking forward to the return of travel, even if it's just local travelers that are coming as guests on the platform. There is still a tremendous demand out there for our host community.
So let me also ask you, Nathan, since we're on that topic, the City of Toronto introduced some new bylaws regarding Airbnb rentals. And for those audience members who are not familiar, essentially now they're saying that it can only be your principal residence or a unit within your principal residence, and you can only rent it for up to 180 days per year. So what are some things people need to keep in mind right now if they're keeping their unit as a short-term rental and conforming with these new bylaws? And predictions on what that might shake down to look like in the future?
For sure. I mean, so the city has passed that bylaw. They are working to implement it still, and it's a lengthy process that we're working very closely with city staff as they do that work. I know that they're looking for an update at City Council in mid-September, and certainly we'll be watching that closely. Once systems are in place for both the host community as well as the platform to register, certainly we will be registering, and we'll see if how other platforms decide to work with that. What I think, and then obviously there's a tax component that we are currently in discussion with the city on as well, that we're more than happy to support the municipal accommodation tax to ensure that cities are getting some of the tax benefit for short-term rentals within their jurisdiction. I think COVID, however, has been a really interesting period that outlined exactly why we needed a flexible housing supply. And I think Kayla mentioned this as well in her previous answer, which is that there is a need for some flexibility. So we had frontline workers staying in Airbnbs throughout the pandemic who needed to isolate from their families or from their roommates. We actually made a sizable donation to the SEIU, the union that represents personal support workers who are doing incredible essential work for senior citizens to ensure that those individuals who might be exposed or want to stay isolated have a place to go that is safe and clean and that is separate from a shared living arrangement in a hotel or traditional hospitality type space. And so I think as the pandemic threat begins to recede and governments will need to start to consider how to help people make ends meet. Well, the economy is still suffering. And, the OECD announced, up to 11% unemployment in H2 for Canada, how people will be able to use some of their best assets to earn some modest supplemental income as the economy begins to recover, and where people will be able to actually help them make ends meet, as opposed to continuing government programs that are costly.
Right. Yep. Good point. So Tree, on that note, it's been a strategy for years for people to have second homes or cottages outside of the city and then rent those out. when they're not in use to help supplement the cost of having those second homes. Have you seen any increase in interest out there in cottage country in the short-term rental industry, or are people looking to buy cottages now to get out of the city?
It's quite a different picture than what's being experienced in Toronto. I suspect it's because we have a different source of demand than Airbnbs in Toronto do. We don't have international business people or even national business people coming here. It's tourists. And where they're coming from is Toronto. And they're stir crazy and they can't wait to get out of town. And as soon as the province allowed short-term rentals to reopen again, the places are booking out. Demand is very, very high at this moment for short-term rentals in Prince Edward County. And that's because we get our demand from people in Toronto. At the same time, there is what can only be called an explosive increase in demand for the purchase of homes in the county. May obviously was below seasonal normals. Sales from May to June doubled, almost exactly doubled, which is unheard of. And every realtor in the business, their phone's ringing off the hook. I put that down to a couple of things. One, people are stir crazy, stuck wherever for 4 months. And the dialogue goes something like this: honey, we've been talking about a getaway in the county for years. Now it's time to pull the plug. Or alternatively, what was the old saying? Idleness is the devil's work. I can imagine a situation where a professional working flat out, trying to climb the greasy pole, has 4 months sitting at home with family and has too much time to reflect and realizes that, is this really what they want from life? And makes a kind of a shift in life, a decision to shift lifestyle. I've had that. I have multiple clients in that setting now. In fact, I described that to one new client, and he said, "You've read my soul." So that's been enabled. The pandemic, ironically, has enabled working from home in a whole new way that will benefit the county. A lot of us in professions have been able to do work or occasional work from home, but up until now, we couldn't go to meetings from home, or if you're a professional, you often have to sell. So if you're an architect and you're pitching a $250,000 project, the client expects you to be there in person.
Right.
Today, they don't want you there in person. And I suspect going forward, you will be able to have you'll be able to go to meetings and sell projects from the county. So that particularly for, perhaps less so for managers who have to supervise a team, but for professionals, we're seeing a giant uptick in demand.
Sure. Vivien, are you hearing that from clients right now? Are people looking to make lifestyle changes in the midst of this? Is this causing them to either fast track, plans to move out of the city, or to move up, or to retire?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there are many buyers. I mean, coming into the pandemic, there were a lot of people that were thinking of buying, perhaps on the sidelines. And I think we came into the pandemic with such high demand that people, even now, they're using this time to think and plan. And there's quite a few active buyers out there in Toronto. And I know for a fact that there's people that perhaps were considering Toronto and now they don't need to be as close to their offices. And, they might be looking, a bit further out where you can get a little bit more space and not be, not spend as much. So I do see that there are some changes in the trends. So, I think the main trends I'm seeing are that people who are living in condos right now, perhaps they've moved in with their partners and now they realize they need a bit more space because they're all making phone calls at home. So they need a little bit more space. And then some people who are, maybe thinking of buying and originally thinking of buying in Toronto are now expanding their search a little bit because they don't really need to be in the city, or perhaps choose to be a bit further out.
So Kayla, one of the things you mentioned earlier was, there are complications for transferring your unit back and forth between a short-term rental, like an Airbnb, and a long-term rental. What are some of the considerations investors need to think about if they are considering converting to a long-term rental from, say, someone who previously only offered it on Airbnb?
Well, if you're having your tenants inside of your, let's say you went into long-term and you rented it out for the year, or you're renting it out month to month. Even after that month-to-month lease has expired, or the one-year lease has expired, or you're going from month to month, and you think that, oh, they're just month to month, I can give them notice to leave. You got to have a justified reason to get them to leave the house. It's either you're taking it over for their own personal use, you're evicting them based on the renovations that need to happen, but you have to offer it back to the tenant at that rate. Now they, being implemented right now to punish landlords who are trying to abuse that way of evicting people. And there's going to be a heftier fine for the landlords if they choose to go ahead and very cautious on that. So and even if you have a year lease, you think that you can kick them out after a year lease, and in reality it just goes month to month. So you still have no way of trying to tell that tenant that you want them to leave because you want to open it up as an short-term Airbnb unit again, unless you're doing a cash for keys type of deal and saying, listen, this is my plan for this place, what it was. Now because of COVID, now I want to go back. Can I offer you X amount of money and give you this much time frame for you to leave? And hopefully that relationship with your tenant works. If not, the tenant will have rights to that property, and it'll be really difficult for you to turn it back into a short term.
A really common question we're getting right now is, a big concern for landlords is non-payment of rent. And so how difficult is it to kick out a tenant? And how big of a concern is this? And how often is this happening? And are we seeing a massive uptick in this? We're hearing all of these kind of like scary reports that we're going to start to see some of this. Are we seeing that in case?
Well, you're definitely, you definitely got me on that one. So there is over 80,000 applications that are brought to the Landlord and Tenant Board on their recent stats that they've given out. And with those over 80,000 applications, landlords are 90% of those applications. And the number one application for the landlords are the non-payment of rent, which is 50,423 rental applications for non-payment of rent. So if you can consider the huge backlog that the Landlord and Tenant Board has already been experiencing, and I would say in the last couple of years, but there's been problems like this for the last decade with the way that the Landlord and Tenant Board is running. And luckily for us now, the Attorney General Doug Downey is now revisiting how he can change the way that they handle disputes. So we're on the edge of our seat wondering what that's going to look like. Is it going to speed up the process? Is it going to make it more complicated? And can we deal with the elected officials and create a better policies that work for the good landlords and for the good tenants, and in order to protect the housing supply? Because this is not about trying to kick out tenants who are just, down on their luck, they can't pay their rent. There's programs, government programs out there to help those people. These are people who are just abusing the system and going through the loopholes and trying to stay in these units as long as they possibly can before the sheriff comes to evict them. So we have to get ourselves into that concept that on a normal way before COVID, you could be looking at 7 months to evict someone. And now after COVID, unless they make the changes that are absolutely needed to speed up these eviction process for the people who have just taken advantage of COVID, it could be a lot longer, and we could see maybe an 18-month, maximum 24. It all depends if your tenant does know the further loopholes and know how to appeal the Landlord and Tenant Board judgment.
Wow, that's really good, especially for landlords that are thinking about temporarily making that jump. Vivien, if a landlord decides to sell in the future, is it going to impact their ability to market a property if the tenant's not a great tenant?
I mean, COVID or not, I think having a tenant can be an obstacle. I'm not saying always, because sometimes you do have a really great tenant. But if a landlord is trying to sell a property that is tenanted, there are certain things that they may not be able to do, like refresh the property or make certain updates. So, there can be some challenges associated with selling a rental property. And I know today with all there's more delinquent tenants now, and so more buyers and investors, both of them, end users and investors, are a little bit more cautious when they see that a unit is tenanted, because it takes that extra due diligence to see if this tenant that's living in the property they're considering is perhaps one that's delinquent, and maybe they won't move. And of course, with the landlord and tenant board not working right now, it's going to be a bit more challenging if they have to assume a delinquent tenant. So there are a little bit more considerations for a buyer who's considering a tenanted property.
Sure, absolutely. So we've seen rents historically kind of skyrocket, I guess we could say, in the GTA. They've continued to go up, and as people are buying more expensive houses, they are more likely to, say, rent a portion of their property, like a basement apartment, to help afford or offset the costs of their home. Nathan, is Airbnb doing anything currently to assist the city of Toronto to crack down on illegal short-term rentals or illegal even long-term rentals?
I don't think that's, no, not really. I mean, the city of Toronto will have a registration system in the near future that hosts will be responsible for registering. On our platform, we will be ensuring that hosts have a registration number. We'll be sharing that data with the city so that the city has the tools it needs to ensure that short-term rental hosts are licensed by the city. But I think it's also, an unfair characterization to say that the short-term rental market has like a significant impact on the housing rental market per se. I think it's I don't think it's a material difference when you look at the size of the city of Toronto and the number of short-term rentals in the city. And then I think as well, what we're seeing a lot, the media keeps reporting as early as today, in fact, that that they're seeing more and more Airbnb units put on the market. The reality is again, we have more units today on the platform than we did in January of 2020. And the reality is as well, as someone who's renting in Toronto and currently hiding out outside of Toronto, as I have been since I assumed the city would be shutting down, well, first of all, when I reached out to my landlord to say, hey, I'm not living there anymore for a few months now, I'd love some kind of discount, or I'm just going to leave. They were more than happy to provide a significant discount for the months that I wasn't living there. And secondly, there's a total change in the supply-demand dynamics in the city at the moment. There are less people moving into the city. Toronto has been on a growth trajectory that's been like crazy. The reality is that as that has slowed down to basically a standstill during the pandemic, we have less demand on the market while supply continues to grow, albeit slowly, in the condo market, maybe not in the rental housing market, for which I would tell the government that it should, check in with itself on its policies there. So I think there's various different kind of factors leading to what is the rental housing market today in the city.
Any thoughts on that, Kayla?
I think it's true. Like our Toronto, we're in the Cambridge, Kitchener, Waterloo area, and we have a few rental units that just popped up on the market. And the amount of interaction that we're getting from residents living in Toronto are crazy. I'm getting more people from Toronto moving into this place. It's like every 6 messages, there's like 6 of them are people from Toronto, and then you're like, oh, I'm from Cambridge. I'm like, I want to move into Kitchener. I'm like, oh, we got someone from the area, right? So you can see that, and then it goes back to, I think it was Nathan's concept, that you can work now from home. It's not going to be going back to the norm where you have to be so close to the city. And if you can come down here and pick up a property to buy really, really cheap compared to Toronto prices, or you're looking at, a full house at $1,700 versus, a full house in Toronto, that's where I think we're seeing a lot of moving, a lot of changing happening. And it could be a good thing, because now we may not need all that construction on the 401. It's always going to be there. It's always going to be there.
Yeah, and I want to add to that, because even before COVID, because in Toronto, like the prices are not accessible to a lot of people, and I would be working with young couples or small families, and there was always a trade-off. Like, do you want to stay in the city and be close to work and have a smaller space, or do you want to move a bit further out and have more space, but you just have to sacrifice a bit of time to commute every day? So there was always that trade-off.
Yeah. But
If I
Vivien,
could,
oh yes, please.
I wanted to come back to an observation that Nathan made about the fact that short-term rentals are not so big a portion of the Toronto market that they really affect availability and affordability. There's a saying in real estate that all real estate is local, and I think this really illustrates it, because while that may be true in Toronto, it's exactly the polar opposite in Prince Edward County and maybe other smaller rural areas. We have about 12,000 dwellings in the county in total. I mean, to put it in perspective, we're 25,000 people in total. There's probably more people in the beach in Toronto than there are here. But so we've got 12,500, 12,000-ish dwellings. Over a period of 3.5 years, we went from 300 short-term rentals to over 1,200 short-term rentals that are whole house rentals. In other words, it's not that the owner's living there, it's absentee, or it's somebody's retreat that they're renting out part-time. That has had a dramatic impact on housing affordability here. And I can give one real life example that kind of says it all. A modest, 5 years ago, a modest farmhouse, 1 acre, kind of run down, to be honest, went on the market for $95,000. And for $95,000, you don't get the Taj Mahal. It was very modest and it was affordable. It was a rental. It got sold for, I think, $95,000, $100,000, whatever. And the owners bought it and tarted it up very nicely and used it as a short-term rental. And a year and a half ago, put it back on the market for $435,000. It is never going to be a $95,000 home again. It's kind of an upward ratchet. It's like a Venus flytrap. It only goes one way. And so when 10% of your housing stock, over a short-term period, you go from, say, 3% to 10% of your housing stock taken out of the full-time rental market, taken out of the residential market, it had a dramatic impact, and which was what drove ultimately licensing and regulation.
Sure. Wow.
If I could just,
yeah.
Sorry, just on that one, like I have no doubt that there is an element of that that you're right about. It also correlates directly with the growth in the winery industry, the growth in the hotels, the growth in Wellington as a tourist destination. I've enjoyed traveling there and drinking wine, staying in an Airbnb and nearby. So I think as some of these towns begin to grow as tourist destinations, I'm just outside Haliburton, Ontario, and I'm seeing, a lot of very full short-term rentals. As they grow as a tourist destination, there is an inevitable growth in the bed and breakfast and the short-term rental market that will totally change the price dynamics in any jurisdiction.
It's not, my point wasn't to blame anyone.
Oh, no.
I'm a business guy, but to point out kind of the unintended consequences. It's accelerated gentrification because it's a way to make gentrification pay, at least when the market's good.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Vivien, the condo market's cooled since the pandemic. I mean, there's lots of, kind of rush into some pre-construction projects that are happening right now. But overall, the condo market's cooled since the pandemic. Is it a good time to buy a condo? And if it is, what are some of the things that you're cautioning investors and even, residential buyers on right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I am thinking back to, early 2020 when I was working with a couple investors, and man, it was heated. There were multiple offers on there and places were selling for, over what it was worth. And, it definitely has cooled since COVID-19 happened. I think the market is relatively balanced. So, in a balanced market, prices will be more steady. But, I think because the rental market has softened quite a bit and the rental prices have come down, it really does affect the cash flow calculations for investors. So, with the lower rent prices, it's a little bit harder to break even with an investment condo. And I would say that's, a very important consideration for most landlords. I mean, not every landlord, but ideally you want to buy a property that's going to cash flow, if be positive, if not neutral, right? So it's a bit more challenging. And then on top of that, because the rental market is more saturated, it can be, you have to be a little bit more patient to find a tenant and to find the right tenant. Because if you're going to rent at a lower price, you really want to make sure you screen properly and you find a good tenant that's not going to cause, that's going to maintain the property. So there are additional, I guess, hesitations perhaps from investors who are looking to purchase.
Sure. Kayla, for someone who wants to buy an investment property right now, we don't really know where the market's going. All of us wish we had a crystal ball. We don't. Not just the market, but just in terms of social freedoms for the rest of the year or so. How can somebody make a sound investment right now during the midst of all of this?
You know what? I think we're going to still base ourselves. Where are you buying? Because, I find it very shocking that the rental rate is going down in Toronto, and here it's still going up. A place that needs some serious TLC, some paint, some floors, and the amount of interaction that you're getting on it, and in $1,700 plus utilities, people are still wanting it. I've been looking at rental properties myself, and you still have many off-market deals, very competitive offers that are coming in on those off-market deals. And the best thing that you're doing there is about still working with the tenants through COVID, but a lot of things are getting back to normal. And that's why we're very shocked to see that this eviction ban is still in place, because we do have, the curb benefits. You are working yourself, going back to work. And we want to know why it's still on an eviction ban when people, you just have to make sure that you're working with the tenants and showing proper documentation that you've tried to work with your tenants, you're trying to work a payment plan with them, because I think that's what's really going to really decide how the adjudicator or the mediator, how the landlord and tenant board opens up again, how they're really going to decide if that eviction process should be pushed through and how fast.
What can landlords do right now if their tenants aren't paying rent?
It's the documentation, giving them, like I don't have it with me right now. I can't read it word for word, but you're giving out that documentation to say, we understand through COVID you may have been affected from it. Please let us know so that we can work with you. We're willing to work at a payment plan. And if you show that your tenant hadn't gotten that paperwork back with you with a payment plan, or you show that they're being very aggressive and not wanting to pay just because there has been a movement of rent strikers throughout the province before COVID. So now this has now just increased that movement for them to stop paying their rent. So this showing that communication, the documentation that you're trying to work with them, and making sure that you're still filing at the landlord and tenant board. I want to stress that enough, because a lot of landlords think that, they're not pushing these evictions through. So why even bother with these notices, or why bother filing your L1 application? They're still accepting the application. So make sure that you file it so that you are in queue for when that situation happens. And hopefully that you're able to weather the storm that you could be going through where the tenant is not paying. But in reality, when you want to get into rental properties, they always give you that one rule of thumb, is that you have to make sure that you're covering your tenants for 6 months without paying a single dollar for rent. So let's hope that everyone has some rainy day fund money put aside, and try not to defer any rental payment. Even though it is a rental, you may not get approved for it, but if you somehow do, try not to, because it could mess up your borrowing power for the future.
Yeah, absolutely. So Tree, you've written a lot. You've written extensively about the need for investors in Prince Edward County to be cautious. What are some of your primary concerns?
A lot of the people I see purchasing properties as short-term rentals, I'll call it Airbnb sort of generically, it's by millennials and mid-career professionals, very sophisticated people, maybe know the theory of the real estate market, but to be honest, have never lived through a real downturn. They didn't live through 1990. I had a home when the market locked up, prices fell $5,000 a week. And there were no market takers because everybody was waiting for the market to bottom. It took 13 years for prices to recover. And so the returns on short-term rentals as an investor are potentially very attractive. But what 9 out of 10 people have been doing is neglecting the risk side. It's high return and it's very high risk. spending $1,000, you know, for a couple on a weekend in a nice Airbnb in Wellington, going to the Drake, kill a couple of bottles of good wine, seems very important maybe now, but if we're in a recession or if COVID-19 roars back, it's going to fall from the top of, it's a discretionary expenditure that can quickly fall off the table. And it's not just about COVID-19. We are overdue in terms of the business cycle for a significant downturn. Downturns happen. Nobody knows when, but as sure as night follows day, it's going to happen. So my advice to clients was, don't be intoxicated by the immediate returns. Look at the risk as well. And before you make a purchase, ensure that you've got a B plan. Ensure you might not want to go there, but if you had to go there, even if it was uncomfortable, even if it was operating at a loss, could you make a viable go of it as a long-term rental? And if the answer is no, then don't make the investment because you're not prepared to cover yourself. It's not going to end well when the market inevitably turns down. The good news, I realize Residential Tenancies Act applies here the same way it does in Toronto with all the same burdens for landlords. The county, at least unless something changes, you know, over the next few months, has an incredible shortage of rental accommodation at all price points. The municipality did a study, Toronto, this was about 14 months ago, had 1.2% vacancy rate and considered that it was in crisis. We had 0.8% vacancy rate. So the option is definitely there to convert to long-term rentals, cognizant of all of the, you know, of all of its own risks that, you know, that have been outlined. But the bottom line is, if you're going to be an investor in this kind of real estate venture, you need to keep your eye on the risks as well as the rewards, and make sure you can weather the storm before you jump in.
Yeah, very good advice. So Nathan, kind of in the same vein, I mean, things are different now, right? I mean, we're facing a different situation than we were 4 or 5 months ago, and we've all had to sort of adjust. How has Airbnb shifted in light of, you know, all of this pandemic? And obviously we're seeing less discretionary income. We're seeing less people travel into the city to go to sporting events and concerts and visit their kids who are in school. You know, how has travel changed? And overall, like, what are the shifts that you're seeing, and what are some of the trends that you're seeing? And how can that compare to maybe some other cities who are further along or further back in the process?
Yeah, so it's actually been fascinating. We don't know how long any of this is going to last for. But what our data shows right now is that almost 60% of our current bookings in Canada are in non-urban markets. So people are not traveling to Toronto or Vancouver or Montreal, but they're traveling to the county, to Huntsville and other places. Domestic travel was already a steadily growing portion of our travel in Canada. In 2015, you know, we had under 40% of bookings by guests from Canada were domestic. By 2019, that had rose to 60% of bookings. So we're seeing a lot more of local travel around the world, certainly in the United States. Like over 20% of bookings over the 4th of July weekend in the States were in rural areas, you know, within about 150 to 200 kilometers, you know, from their homes. We're also finding that what guests are looking for is a couple of big trends. Families, growth in family bookings on Airbnb has dramatically outpaced growth in non-family travel. Nights booked for family travel is also growing. So I think one of the things I think Treat said earlier about people like looking to travel out to places like the county because they can now work there. Or, you know, I've been working from Halliburton for 4 months. I didn't ever think I would be able to, or would imagine that with questionable internet quality. But we're finding more and more long-term bookings on the platform. So 30, 60, 90 night bookings of people who say, you know, I might not be leaving leaving Toronto. I still need, you know, sushi delivery to my home every once in a while. Certainly that's why I return back to the city. But I can, if I can work for 30 or 60 or 90 nights away, at least I'm not working from where I have been the entire time during this pandemic. So it's gone from work from home to work from somewhere else, which I think is an interesting trend. People are looking for uncrowded. The fewer people who live at the destination, the higher the booking growth has been. Domestic bookings for recent weeks are up like 50% year over year to rural destinations, those with like fewer than 250 people per square kilometer. And the last kind of really, and obviously outdoor, sparsely populated areas, but the last interesting trend has been the desire from our guests for making sure that something is clean. So when you're thinking about travel, no one is going to promise a COVID-free environment. It'd be irresponsible to do something like that. But I think what folks are saying is, I want something with cooking facilities, because I don't want to go to a restaurant necessarily, and I don't want to go to the hotel to the hotel bar downstairs. I want something that I can cook at, and I can bring my own things from the LCBO or the local store. So we've recently announced enhanced cleaning, where hosts have to go through a step-by-step guide to ensure that a place has been sanitized down, and that's what our guests are expecting of them. Certainly during the pandemic, for frontline workers, we had very, very specific rules that a host had to follow to ensure that a space was clean for them, including like a 3-day buffer between guests when a frontline worker was going to be staying there, to ensure that it was as clean as humanly possible. And so I think that is what is going to be at the forefront of guests and host minds as we begin to bring back safe and sustainable travel industries.
Sure. Wow. Okay. So we've covered a lot. And I guess as I'm listening to all this, it seems like a really complicated place to be for someone who is an investor or has a unit that they want to rent or needs to make some additional income off of their properties, because on one hand, we're seeing increased issues with getting evictions through. We're seeing increased demand for cleaning and safe spaces if it's a short-term rental. We're seeing that more people are thinking about moving outside of the city. And so, potentially that's going to create some issues in more rural areas, as Treat's saying. And, as Vivien mentioned, like we still have all of this happening in the core where people have to live and have to work and have to rent their properties. So I'd love for all of you to sort of give me, your best takeaway, your best advice for investors and landlords right now who are thinking about renting, about having tenants, about whether that's in the city, in the country, in a more rural area. Thoughts for people that are saying, look, I have to rent my property. So this is going to be a long-term situation, or this is going to be an Airbnb situation. Best advice for them. Kayla, do you want to have a crack at that first?
So first and foremost, I would really encourage all investors who want to get into it or are in the game, that they have to get very knowledgeable on how the government is involved in this housing industry and learn about the rules and the policies and how to give your suggestions on how to make it better. But most importantly, because it's such a painful process to advocate and get these changes out there that can really benefit good landlords, good tenants, and taxpayers, the best thing that we can do is, as we go through this storm with our elected officials, is making sure that you're picking the great tenant. Because if the Landlord and Tenant Board is not there to protect you, if the Residential and Tenancy Act is not there to protect you, then you need to make sure that you're partnering with a good tenant so that you both can be in this business together. And if you're not good at it, you can always have a property manager company to come in and do that for you, or do it with you for that matter, and just make sure that you're getting a right property manager as well to protect yourself and the interest, because this is a long-term retirement plan that you get into when you get into long-term rentals. It's not as quick get rich quick as what people think it is. So just make sure that you're getting the right tenants so that you can run your business as best as you can.
Awesome. Vivien, best advice for investors and landlords?
Yeah, I would really echo what Kayla was saying. It's really just to be educated about what it really is to be a landlord if someone's considering, getting into that business. Learning as much as they can about the system, and on the topic of if somebody is looking to invest in a condo, because I know that there were a lot of investors that were on the sidelines even coming into the pandemic, and I know there's people that are active now thinking maybe it's a good opportunity. I would really encourage them to understand, some of the risks with purchasing, and because with the landlord and tenant board being the way it is right now, like how long is it going to go on for, making sure that they do the proper calculation so they know exactly, what their cash flow is for their business, and perhaps using, more conservative numbers, and of course doing the proper screening for the tenant for their property.
Yeah. Tree?
Sorry, the three pieces of advice. First, look before you leap, which the previous two speakers have pointed to. Real estate is an illiquid investment, and there are high transaction costs. You can't, it's not like buying a mutual fund. You don't like it, you turn it over tomorrow, and you pay an $8 fee to the discount broker or whatever it is. Particularly in a small market, properties take a long time to sell. 5 years ago, average length of time on market in the county was 180 days. It's currently running close between 40 and 50 days average time on market. So it's an illiquid investment, so you better know what you're doing before you get into the middle of it. Second, I'd encourage small investors to limit their systemic risk. Contain your risks. So for example, I've had several clients whose initial thinking was, rather than going through the pain in the neck of taking out a mortgage, they were going to buy a getaway / short-term rental in the county by drawing on a home equity line of credit. Bad idea, because you've taken a local risk, maybe the failure of your venture in Prince Edward County, and turned it into a threat to your principal residence. If you had a business failure in your, the market dried up and you couldn't meet your payments. So ring fence your risk, and don't put your primary residence in play in order to support an investment right now. And finally, choose wisely, as has been pointed out. The good news in a small town, or at least our small town, the demand for rentals so outstrips the supply. They're never in the newspaper. They always go by word of mouth. And if you have good relationships and friends in the community, that's a highly effective way to recruit tenants. Depend on referrals from people you trust is the bottom line.
Awesome.
You can do that in a small town. In a city of millions and millions, not so much maybe.
Not so much. Nathan, best advice for hosts?
I guess, what I have more advice for government than I have for hosts. But,
they need
Don't we all?
What I'd say is, 2% of our hosts have said that hosting helps them afford to live in their homes, and that about 20% of the household income, an average of 20% of household income is made up of earnings through hosting. When you think about the 8.5 million guests who stayed on our platform in Canada in kind of end of 2017 through the end of 2018, the economic impact of those visitors on our communities, for restaurants, for attractions, for shops in our cities, is so important. And I just think as we get through what is going to be a difficult recession, a difficult time during COVID, we have to think about how people are going to be earning income. And this is a good way for people to earn some modest supplemental income as they get through this pandemic, and especially for younger individuals who are trying to get into the housing market. It is a good way to supplement that income. And so I just think government, as they consider different tools, should really be thinking about the tourism industry writ large, as well as the various different opportunities people have to supplement their income in tough times.
Sure, makes sense. Absolutely. Okay, so I have two final questions for all of you. First one is this. The theme of this summit is smart caution. What does smart caution mean to you? Vivien?
Yeah, smart caution. I mean, I think we're in a time of uncertainty right now. And while we all hope for, we'll make it through this, but we have to also expect for the worst and prepare for the worst. So, I mean, I guess in the context of long-term, short-term rentals, how can we best protect ourselves, and what are some precautions we should take, someone's looking to purchase, or or if they're looking to rent out the property.
Sure. Treat smart caution.
I think I'll be brief. I think I've already addressed it. Look before you leap,
Yeah.
know the risk and contain your risk. Don't put your house in play.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
be sure there's always a B plan.
That's right. Nathan, smart caution.
My advice will be to guests at the summit here, as you begin to think about traveling locally this summer, is to check the reviews on your Airbnb listing. 94% of our guests give our hosts 4 or 5 stars for cleanliness, but check those reviews and make sure that you're getting what you want when you're traveling across the province.
Absolutely. Kayla, smart caution.
Be smart when you buy and be very cautious when you rent it out to these potential tenants.
Oh, good one. Okay, I have one last question and I just want your gut reaction, all right? Ready? Would you buy or sell a home right now?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I have buyers active right now, and most people are buying because they're looking to hold on for the longer term. So, if you're looking to hold on to a property longer term, you're going to ride out these short-term ups and downs. So these, perhaps could be, end users or even, investors that are buying, being cautious about buying and are perhaps holding on for 5 years or, for the longer term. And hopefully, that would mitigate the risk of selling at a loss.
Nathan, would you buy or sell right now?
I think I would buy, but I wouldn't be selling.
Fair enough. Kayla?
Same thing. I'd be buying, not selling, based on what you're looking to buy, like the bigger buildings. If you can actually find yourself a good investment property, you got to jump on that. And you're always going to need the need of housing. You're always going to need for short-term rentals, because that's a part of the whole hotel tourism, a part of temporary housing. Right now we have people who, where did they go when these shelters became full through COVID? They went to our hotels. So people who are still looking to move or move around and travel still, where are they going? They're going to be looking for short terms. So they're going after short terms unfairly because they think that it's going to flood the market with the supply that they're looking for. But in reality, they just need to look at the Residential and Tenancy Act, the Landlord and Tenant Board, and understand the need of short-term rentals.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for all of you for being here today and for participating. I know that our audience will get a lot out of this. Thanks for answering all of those questions, and just for providing your expertise. Thank you so much.
And a pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you
Very much.